Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and in today's episode, we're going to be featuring the audiobook of the new translation of Capital by Karl Marx. And with us today is Paul Reitter, Paul North, and Simon Vance. Gentlemen, welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi.
Thank you for having us.
Hi. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling ourselves a little about yourselves. Introduce yourself by name so we can distinguish whose voice is whose.
Sure. I'm Paul Reitter, and I teach in the German department at Ohio State University. And I am a translator and I suppose something of a historian of translation and also a scholar, to use the term broadly, I suppose, of German Jewish intellectual history and culture and the history of higher education.
I'm Paul North. Like Paul Reitter, I'm a professor of German, and I teach German Jewish thought and philosophy. Mainly what I've been working in the past 10 or 15 years has been critical theory, which is philosophy with a worldly kick.
Good grief. I'm Simon Vance. I'm an audiobook narrator, in awe of both Paul North and Reitter. I did get a degree in economics some 40 years ago, which I think helps with this book. But beyond that, I worked for the BBC in the 80s and Radio 4, and I moved to California, which is where I am now in early 90s. And I've been an audiobook narrator pretty much, aside from a bit of acting left, right, and center. With in the last 20, 25 years, I've done nothing much but audiobook narration.
One of the things I'm looking forward to exploring is how your experience, Simon, with audiobook narration informed your approach to Capital. Because with all due respect to Reitter North, I mean this, and this is my, this is I say with respect to Mr. Reitter, Mr. North, this. Capital is not known for being an easy book to read.
Yeah, yes, I'd agree with you there.
So I was wondering if we could start off by talking a bit about the genesis of this translation, and this question is directed specifically to Paul Reitter. Capital is a book that has been in print for over a century, and there are translations. Why do we have a new translation of the book? What were the other ones lacking that necessitated the need for this new translation?
Well, I had been teaching the text in English translations, mostly the Fowkes translation from about 50 years ago for quite a while before I really decided that I wanted to do the translation. And that was a lot of the motivation for doing the translation. There were other things going on in the world when I set off on this with Paul North in late 2018 that played a role. But a big part of the motivation was just teaching the text and feeling as though the existing translations, the more Aveling translation and the Fowkes translation, the more Aveling translation is the original 1886 translation, the Fowkes translation is from 1976, feeling that those translations didn't convey things that I wanted to convey. And I know that we don't have that much time, and so I'm going to paint with very broad strokes here, but generally speaking, you can say that the more Aveling translation, like a lot of first translations, really tries to ease its readers into a text that they are, of course, unfamiliar with, and they're not necessarily that familiar with the author either, because Marx wasn't that famous when Capital appeared in English for the first time in 1886, 1887. And I think that they did a good job of producing a readable text, and it definitely has its moments of inventive brilliance. They do a good job with Marxist snark, but they are very loose with Marxist conceptual vocabulary, and there are certain aspects of Marxist style that don't get preserved very well. Curiously, because Engels, who oversaw that project, was very, very attached to these elements of Marxist style, concision and vigor, something he kept talking about, but also the way that the prose moves in the book and the changes of register. These things I don't think get preserved so well in the more Aveling edition, and maybe even less so in the Fowkes edition, which really goes for formal equivalence a lot of the time, although there are complications, as I said, and Vaux actually borrows a lot more from Moore Aveling than he lets on in his translator's preface, where he basically says that he is kind of the anti-Moore Aveling in his translation. So there's an element of conversation in retranslations. You can't prioritize everything, so you try to prioritize often things that you don't think came across so well in the previous translations. And here that would be conceptual precision, preserving the neologisms, the Marxist conceptual neologisms, and the way that the concepts relate to one another, and then also various stylistic features that are that signify in important ways. I don't think of these things as being ornamentation, the way the text moves, the changes of register, things things like that, humor as well. And there's a lot that went into trying to preserve these things. It's not just like, okay, well, Marx seems to be making a joke here. I'm really going to try to render this joke in such a way that it's funny. In English, you have to pay a lot of attention to what's going on around the joke. If you translate the technical language around the joke in a certain way, maybe with too much formal equivalence, then the joke is not going to seem like a refreshing change of register, but more like a crazy stylistic lurch. So that's some of what I was dealing with. Those are some of the motivations and goals of the translation. Obviously, it's not for me to say whether or not it achieved its goals, but this is where I was coming from or hoping to get to a large extent.
From your description, it points out something else that I do want to highlight, which is how the audience. I inferred from some of the things you were saying about how the audience for this has changed a little bit, and sort of the interest in it has changed. And so I'm wondering, what were some of the challenges you had with taking what was basically a 19th century German text and then presenting it in a way that a 21st century English audience would appreciate what Marx meant and what Marx intended?
This text is, I think, going to come across as an attempt to make Marx sound contemporary because I used language that I think will often sound natural to 21st century English speakers, but I really wasn't trying to modernize Marx as translations sometimes do. This is not that kind of translation. When I read Marx in German, he really sounds a little bit out of time to me in the sense that while the text is marked as a 19th century text in various ways by what it talks about, by the way it talks about Gladstone as a contemporary figure, on the level of the syntax, it doesn't read anything like most 19th century German texts. It's much more like Nietzsche than it is like Leopold von Ranke, who was a very famous 19th century German historian who wrote in these long, coiling sentences with lots of internal clauses. Marx has some long sentences, but very often they're building up to a punchline. And a lot of the time, the sentences are very concise. There's a lot of subject, verb, object sentence order in the German. German can go both ways, subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb. It's become more of a subject, verb, object language as it models itself more on English. And so for these reasons, Marx's German prose syntactically does not feel to me like 19th century prose, normal 19th century prose, most of the time, whatever normal 19th century prose is. There are a lot of strange usages in the text, and there's a lot of heavy personification having to do with the way Marx sees the capitalist system. So it's not like the text just sounds natural throughout, or the text can just be rendered into natural 21st century English throughout, and you feel like you have a decent match for the German that Marx produced in the 19th century. But that issue was less of one than you might expect, the one that you mentioned.
Now, translating the language is only part of the process of making this text accessible. There's also the heavy work of editing. And that's something that both Paul Reitter and Paul North did. And I'd like to talk to you, Paul North, about your introduction to the project and what you and how you approach the process of editing this book, which is one for which there's so much commentary about, and there's so much critiquing of. How did you go about it, and how did you approach it in terms of the audience that you wanted to read this?
Thanks. Well, you can't read everything, and that's especially true for Marx. But there's several traditions of interpretation that Paul Reitter and myself read through that have really developed to a point of real clarity over 150 years. And that's one of the benefits of this edition, that you could make decisions about concepts, about what notes to put, about how to introduce it, given that there has been socialist experiments. There has been a Lenin. There has been a Moïse Poston, a very important American interpreter of the text. And there has been the school of value theory in Germany, all of which have changed the way we see not only this text, but Marx's whole project. And in fact, the challenge of doing an edition now is that we know so much more, even than was understood when the last translation was made in the 70s, about how big Marx's project was. Famous Latin American interpreter and Marxist and philosopher Enrique Dussel calculated that volume 1 is about 1/72nd of the whole Capital project. If you take all the drafts going from what's called the Grundrisse all the way through corrections and things he made, and the manuscripts for the other 2 volumes. So it fits in a continuum of Marx's work, and it fits in a large project in which Marx was looking at this thing he called Capital from a number of different directions. Volume 1 is about production. Volume 2 is about circulation. Volume 3 is about the system as a whole, including banking and credit and profit rates and things like that. So now that we know how it's oriented, we can make a lot better decisions. We also had the luck of going from the German critical edition, which has been a project going on since really before the Soviet era, to produce a reliable edition of all of Marx and Engels' works. And this has benefited from the work of incredible philologists who are incredibly rigorous and chase down all the sources and, dithered over the meanings of words. And we had access to that in order to make our decisions. So editorially, we had a very good text. And in fact, this is the first time Marx's second German edition, has been translated into English. All the other English translations are from either the third or fourth editions, which were put together by Engels using other sources. But the second edition was authorized by Marx, for what that's worth. So this is a translation of that edition. Beyond that, we made...
Apologies for interjecting, but do you point out the differences between the editions in any of the notations for the book?
We sure do. We spend a long time talking about that in the introductions. There are appendixes which compare the editions, and there's an after essay by William Clare Roberts, a Marxist scholar, about the French translation which Marx oversaw. So instead of putting together a kind of Frankenstein edition, it's a little bit exaggerated to say that because Engels was a very good editor of Marx, but he made decisions which you can't see so well in the other English translations. Here you can see everything laid out for you.
So now both of you were listed as editors. Was this a collaborative process? Did you divide chapters and go about it separately and then exchange and consider it that way?
Well, Reitter is very, very hard to work with, so...
Notoriously so, yes.
It was a real struggle. No, we did everything pretty much together. We went back and forth weekly over 5 years in every possible way, writing notes together, trading them to edit them, trading drafts of our introductions. Right, Paul?
Yeah, it got to the point where I would look at some of the notes, our annotations, and say to myself, or ask myself, who wrote this? Was this me? North. And what does that mean? That it's hard for me to tell. Some are, if you know his writing well, obviously him, and some are obviously me. But there were places where we really did seem to produce notes that could have been by either of us. And there was a lot of discussion of translation terms. Paul is a great teacher of the text, and he taught me a lot about the text, and I'm very grateful to him for that, among many other things. And it was also just a lot of fun doing it with Paul. As you've already heard, he's a very funny guy, and so there was a lot of laughing amid all the the exertion.
We laughed a lot when the NEH turned down our application for a grant twice.
I imagine it's either that or cry. So
Yes.
Yeah, that was a little fishy, the way they kept doing things. I think that they may have had some unease around sponsoring a Marx project.
So, I mean, the achievement of a new translation of Capital is significant enough. But what we have here is an audiobook version. And I'd like to turn now to Simon and ask about his approaches, because I mean, I'm not an audiobook listener myself. I have heard a few, but it's a very popular field, and it's one in which there are a variety of different approaches. And I'm really fascinated to find out from Simon how he approached this text, especially a text that is one that is a lot of people are famously put off by its size, its difficulty, and it seems like that adds to the challenge of taking it and making it something that is engaging and enjoyable to listen to.
Yes, it's I think it was the challenge of it that really made me really want to do this. You know, I was invited, would I like to do this? And Karl Marx's Capital, of course I would, especially with, as I mentioned earlier, I have a history of an economics degree way in my past. And I never actually got to look at Karl Marx's books or economic thinking. So I thought this will be new, and it is a challenge. But you know, I do a whole variety of audiobooks. I do not fiction, non-fiction, comedy, murder mystery, all kinds of things. The main thing when it comes to non-fiction generally for a narrator is bearing in mind that we're trying to inform, educate, and convince our audience. And most of the work, as long as we just lift the words off the page, is done by the writer, or in this case, the writer alongside the translators and editors. And so when I came to the book, I was not going to be able to pre-read the whole thing, which is often a good idea, certainly with fiction stories. With non-fiction, not so much. And I'm relying on being able to lift the words off the page. There was some uncertainty at the beginning when I started how much we were going to include. All those essays are in there in the audiobook, the appendices and so on. What we did remove for the listener is the footnotes. Because there were so many of them. And if you're listening to an audiobook, you'll find it so distracting if in the middle of being told about one thing, you're suddenly told about another thing, which may go into another thing, and then you're back to the first thing. So it's often the case in nonfiction that footnotes get removed just for the flow. The question then becomes, who's going to listen to this? And I think if people come from a deep educational side, they're trying to learn something, they can listen to it and have the book with them in front of them, and then at times they can go search the footnotes. But so in a sense, you talked about the audiobooks being popular. We're looking at it, I suppose, from the popular side of things. What's going to let people keep listening? And it's basically the story that's at the root of it, or the many stories that Marx tells here. And it was absolutely extraordinary. And these guys, Paul had 5 years working on it. I had about 5 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks to look at it and then get into the studio, working with a director in London. So I'm in California. So we had a particular time of day we connect. And I would read as an audiobook narrator. I'm a good sight reader. It was complex. I laughed earlier on because it is a very difficult read in that sense. But my job is to make it easy for the listener to pick those thoughts off the page. And I know Paul Reitter mentioned that there are times when Marx is making a joke, or is he making a joke? And we had to confront those moments. And Paul made it it was clear if you looked at it. But there were times when, because as a narrator, I can hint to jokes, not not to play them up or anything like that, but if I read them straight, they don't sound like jokes. When Marx refers to some economists he hates or some writer he hates and goes, he knows exactly what he's talking about. And I could say that flat. So-and-so knew exactly what he was talking about. And people go, oh, he respects him. But if I said, well, Marx, so-and-so knows exactly what he's talking about, or something like that, you kind of hint at things like that to lift that off the page. And the thing I think that surprised me the most about it was, because it's not something outside of being a learned person regarding Marx, I didn't know he had a sense of humor. Now I do. My God, he was a snarky fellow at times.
So both of you helped Simon with the process of interpreting the text. Did you have any ability to comment on the reading as it was taking place, or did you only hear the final product afterward?
Well, I'll come in here because there is a separation. Often in audiobook publishing, there's a separation often between the writers and the audiobook narrator for things like this. I worked with the director I mentioned, Anu, and she was my go-between, as it were. And she would go to the Pauls and things like pronunciations and so on and so forth. But for the most part, it being a fairly straightforward non-fiction explanation of Marx's thoughts, there wasn't really anything to ask about in terms of, I'm confused here, what's going on. There were a couple of occasions, and we often would talk about it, Anu and I, what's going on here. But my basic understanding of economics really helped a lot, even though it's, as I say, 40 years ago. But directly having any communication with Paul North and Paul Reitter it didn't happen.
How do you feel that an audio presentation of the text perhaps changes for the listener how they might interpret the book? Because in a sense, you've both read the book and you've also read it aloud. Do you feel that having it read aloud changes the way we might interpret some of what Marx is saying in ways that may make it more accessible or may have us thinking differently about it?
Well, I certainly hope it makes it more accessible. I do remember years ago, I used to read a lot of Charles Dickens and Anthony Trollope and things, and there were people, and I don't mean dyslexic, but there were people who often have difficulty reading words on the page. And some, especially when it's an old text, and I know this has been brought up to date, but it still sort of possesses some of that sense of depth and complication, if you like, that I have to tease out, that it makes it easier for somebody to listen than to read on the page, because I can, lift it a little more. So people who are used to reading, in university circumstances, whatever, they can pick stuff apart. It's like reading scripts or something like that. Some people can read them and know exactly what they mean. Others can't make head or tail of them. They have to see the play. So I feel like it's sort of, in that sense, I'm lifting it off the page and allowing people to hear it straight into their brains, as it were, without having to translate the black and white on the page.
I love that expression, lifting it off the page. This is Paul North. I have to say there's a great confluence of historical power in having Simon Vance read this, because Marx did spend the majority of his career, after being exiled, first from Germany, then from Paris, then from Brussels, and landing in London, living in London with a lot of English speakers. He knew English. He read the majority of his sources for the economic side of this in English by English political economists. So that is a great little piece of good confluence. Also, Marx was a terrific speechwriter. In fact, you might say this was his best and most effective genre. And a lot of the book is really like a kind of stump speech at a workers' collective, or sometimes, I don't know if you remember this, Simon, but sometimes he'll speak in the voice of the capitalist or speak in the voice of the commodity. Yes. And now the commodity speaks. So it is a dialogic book. I don't know if you found that made it easier.
Yes, I think it did. He's telling story. Yes, I really enjoyed bringing it out, as I say, lifting it off the page, and the things he revealed. There's some heart in there. It's not just dry. It's not, people might look at Das Kapital or Capital, and think, my God, that's going to be too intellectual for me. But no, it is complicated. There are complicated things in there, but every so often I'd stop after having done a chapter or something, then I say, oh my God, that's amazing. Seriously, because I have the understanding, supply and demand economics, but the whole concept of value added, what the worker brings, what the person who's brought the means of production in, how much they take and how it ends up being weighted all the way to the one end. And if things are left without regulation, this is what we have. I mean, it does sort of go from the theory side to the practical. This is what happens in society, the poverty, the manipulation of the workers and so on. I didn't come out of it quite, waving my arm and shouting up the workers, but there's certainly a sense that I think anybody listening to this is going to go, oh, I see what it's all about. It's not because, Marx is what's the way, people go Marxism, socialism, oh my God, it's awful, horrible, don't even want to go near it. It's based in truth. You've got to look at this and listen to it. And if I can help to bring about the truth of the words off the page that describe what's going on at that time, you understand why Marx either felt he had to do this or had the realization that this would be an important book to write. I mean, there's so many motivations for him, I'm sure, at the time, but it was an extraordinary book. And I tell you, one thing that surprised me was that, having done an economics degree, I didn't study Marx at all, as far as I know, in the 70s, all Keynesian or back to Adam Smith. And maybe they were all scared of it at the university I went to. I don't know.
It's coming back,
I think he needs to come back, to be honest. This whole demand and libertarian lack of, not to get too political, but the lack of regulation is, to me, it spelled out how important some form of regulation is. Now, the question is, who regulates that? That's where the complications come with the political systems and so on that are developed around it. But there needs to be a regulation, because otherwise, oh boy, it's a mess.
That actually, to me, gets to why this audiobook version is so important, because one of the things I've been struck by in my time as a reader is how much more central audiobooks are becoming to the reading experience. I came across, of all things, a meme a few days ago where it was like, Gen X to millennials, we know how to read, don't just send us the audio description, send us the written start part itself. It seems that the audio component is becoming a more vital part of it. And I feel like the fact that you have that an effort's been made by Princeton to commission an audio version is going to vastly increase the audience compared to if it had been simply this wonderfully, translated and edited text.
Yes, I entirely agree. I think for all that people may say they read as much, they don't read as much as they used to, and I used to describe audiobook narrating in a sort of roundabout way of the author has an idea in their mind, and I'm trying to I use the words, the pages, the words on the page, and through my speech to trigger those images in the listener's mind. So it's sort of a direct line, rather than having to have the writer write it down and you read it and whatever, buy the book or whatever. It's I'm not being very clear on it, but it was this direct triggering the thoughts in the mind of the listener that were in the mind of the writer. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Oh, it does. Well, we appreciate the time the three of you taken to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now? Paul Reitter?
Yes, I just wanted to add, though, before I talk about that very quickly, that Simon, you mentioned awe at the beginning of this conversation. The awe is really all on our side, meaning we feel awe toward you. We're both big fans of audiobooks and listen to audiobooks quite regularly, and really appreciate your work. I've listened to many of your books, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Shelley, Frankenstein, and I was blown away by all of them. And so I was really, really thrilled when we heard that you were interested in doing this job. And I kind of thought I made that very clear to the people at Princeton. And so when we didn't have contact with you, I thought that that was maybe because they didn't want you to be bothered by these fan characters. I'm glad to hear that that's a standard part of the process. I'm relieved to know that I didn't gush too much.
Yes, we're kept at arm's length from those artists, as it were. But I would always appreciate it. So if we ever get to work again indirectly, just get in touch with me. That's fine.
I would love that. I would love that. And in fact, to answer your question, Mark, we're we're on to volume two, on to the next one. So that's what I'm working on now.
How advanced is it?
Not too advanced. Early days. We're trying to. It's a big philological challenge because, and this was published. Volume two was published after Marx died, published posthumously, and Engels did more editing in this volume than he did for volume three, the last volume of Capital that was published also posthumously. There, he worked primarily from a single manuscript. Here, he had 8 different manuscripts written over more than 15 years. And one of the things he did was to try to make it seem like an integrated work, when in fact, as you would imagine, Marx's thoughts changed quite a bit over that time. So the Engels version, that's an established work in the culture, and that's the one that we want to use as our source text, but we want to make clear or transparent his editing moves as we proceed. So that's a significant philological challenge, and we're strategizing about how best to meet it.
Paul North, do you have any projects in addition to the work on volume two?
Yes, I am writing a book on Marx's Capital project, which is a little bit peculiar. I think one of the facts of the 20th century is that it hasn't seemed to result in a good socialist outcome. There's been a lot of good outcomes from the book. In any case, the book asks the strange question, why don't the capitalists start the revolution?
Now, is that a project that you will be concurrent with the ongoing translation, or will you finish that before you finish the translations?
Oh, I will finish that before we finish the translations. Yeah, that should be done and out in about a year.
Okay. Simon, what are you currently working on?
Well, I just want to say I'm fascinated by the idea of there being more, working more on the future volumes of Capital. I had no idea there were more volumes of Capital, and that's how little I knew about Karl Marx's books back then. For myself right now, I'm all over the map. Prior to Capital, I did all 8 George Smiley books by
wow.
John le Carre, which was quite a thrill. I did a fantasy, science fiction fantasy last week. And funnily enough, I was starting a book this week. I just did a couple of hours of it, which was a children's book, and they just sent me an email the moment before we went on the air with this to say, can you stop recording because the author has already recorded his own version. So I'm now unemployed for the rest of the week, and I'm going to go and do some gardening.
I was going to ask, do you read outside of your job, or?
Oh, I read, well, yes and no. I do like graphic novels and all sorts of things like that, just that are different. But I also have some pretty, I do Free Zacaria's book on revolutions, which was ironic because I started that. Takes me forever to read a book casually, but it includes a section on the Industrial Revolution, which was fascinating. I got to that before we started recording Capital. But I mix and match across the board. But yeah, it's often hard to find something that's going to give me rest, because reading is work.
Well, that's one of the great things about audiobooks. When my eyes are tired from reading, because I have to do a lot of reading for my job, and I want more literary experience, I can switch over to the audiobook. And that's a great thing for it's been a great thing for me, and I know many others.
Well, gentlemen, I really hope that we can have you back on the podcast to discuss the audiobook for volume 2. But until then, I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.